Today, there is more awareness about respiratory hazards in the workplace than ever before, and more is known about how to deal with those hazards effectively to protect you at work. Over the next few minutes, we'll be discussing 4 essential elements for a better understanding of respiratory protection. We'll look at understanding how airborne contaminants present a danger to your health, how to identify hazards in the workplace, how to select the proper respirator, and the importance of training in the proper use and care of the respirator. Our purpose is to help make you more aware of the ways you can protect your health. Let's begin by understanding how contaminants enter the body. There are 3 ways harmful substances enter the body: by swallowing, by absorption through the skin, and through normal breathing. That's where we'll concentrate our attention. When you take a breath, air passes through your nose and mouth, down your throat, and into the smallest areas of your lungs. A very important exchange happens at this point. Oxygen is transferred into the bloodstream through literally millions of tiny air sacs to provide you with the oxygen you need. Unfortunately, the body's own defenses are sometimes not enough protection, especially when concentrations of contaminants are extremely high. Contaminants can inhibit the lungs' ability to exchange oxygen or cause other internal injuries, and that's what we're trying to help prevent. The body has its own set of defenses against airborne substances. As you inhale, nose hairs act as the first line of defense, trapping large particles. Coughing is a defensive reflex that protects your body from many foreign substances. But what happens when the body's defenses just aren't sufficient? Some contaminants create immediate reactions. People cough, sneeze, or choke, become dizzy or nauseated. This acute reaction is easily recognized. More difficult to recognize are chronic responses. These reactions happen very gradually, so that symptoms may not be noticed until years later, when lung damage makes breathing difficult. This gradual process can result in chronic illnesses. When contaminants that cause chronic or acute responses are present, you should wear a respirator. But before we talk about which respirator to wear, let's identify the kinds of hazards that potentially exist. Respiratory hazards can be identified as dusts, mists, fumes, gases, and vapors. Dusts are formed when solid materials are broken down and tiny particles float in the air, by sanding, for example, or grinding, or even sweeping. Mists are tiny liquid droplets suspended in the air. Many mists can be a combination of several hazardous ingredients. An example might be the mists that result from spray painting. Fumes occur when metal is heated, creating very fine particles that drift in the air. Fumes are present during welding and soldering operations. Gases are substances that become airborne at room temperature. Gases can be visible and have a detectable odor, or invisible and odorless, and they can travel great distances undetected. Vapors are substances that evaporate from a liquid or solid at room temperature. Paint thinners, solvents, gasoline all produce vapors. The higher the concentration of dusts, mists, fumes, gases, and vapors, the greater the risk to your health. And remember, in many instances, the contaminants which can cause damage to our bodies are so small we can't see them. And there are 2 other hazardous conditions you must be aware of. One is the lack of oxygen in the air. If the oxygen concentration falls below 19.5% oxygen by volume, people become dizzy, experience ringing in the ears, and can eventually die. A second hazardous condition exists when concentrations of contaminants are immediately dangerous to life or health, known as IDLH. If either of these 2 conditions exist in your workplace, a safety professional must be consulted. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has established standards of air quality that set limits on exposure to respiratory hazards. These are called permissible exposure limits, or PELs. A PEL is defined by OSHA as contaminant concentrations which a worker can be exposed to for an 8-hour shift over a 40-hour week without a significant or known health risk. To completely identify a contaminant and to judge the hazard posed, it is important to know the answers to these questions. What form is the contaminant? How toxic is the substance? What is the individual's sensitivity to the odors or taste of the hazard? Can they smell or taste the contaminant so they can determine when there has been a breakthrough of the contaminant into their breathing zone? What is the concentration of the substance? How long is the worker exposed to the hazard? We need to know the answers to all these questions before we can determine the right method for protecting the worker. There are several ways to protect people from the dangers of breathing contaminants. The contaminant may be eliminated through workplace engineering controls. For example, increased ventilation or increased use of exhaust fans. In some cases, materials that are hazardous can be eliminated, or safer materials can be substituted. Unfortunately, these methods don't always solve the problem. They may be too costly, impractical to implement, time-consuming, or just plain unworkable for a given operation. In that case, a respirator must be properly selected and worn based on the contaminant conditions in the workplace. The third element in understanding respiratory protection is selecting the proper respirator. There are two general classifications of respirators: the air purifying respirator that filters out contaminants, and supplied air respirators that supply fresh air from an uncontaminated source. Air purifying respirators use filters and cartridges to filter the air the worker breathes so that contaminated concentrations are reduced to below the PEL. In the second classification, supplied air, the worker receives clean air through an air line from a compressor, pump, blower, or air cylinder. Uncontaminated air is delivered to the wearer's hood, helmet, or facepiece. No matter what type of respirator you wear, it must be adequate for the contaminant present, it must fit properly, and be accepted by the worker. A respirator that isn't worn, and isn't worn properly, is useless. There is no all-purpose respirator. Each one must be properly selected and used and maintained according to strict procedures in order for it to work properly and effectively in reducing contaminant concentration that the wearer breathes to below the PEL. And that leads us to our fourth element, training. Knowing how to wear the respirator, knowing how to clean and care for it, and knowing when it is no longer effective. To ensure proper fit and seal against the face, always read and follow the manufacturer's fitting instructions. Failure to do so can lead to an improper fit and overexpose the worker. Depending on the contaminant, this can lead to sickness or death. Every time you put your respirator on, a positive or negative pressure fit check should be conducted. By doing this, you should be able to tell if there is a satisfactory seal around your respirator. In addition, OSHA requires that all respirator wearers be quantitatively or qualitatively fit tested at least once or twice a year. Irritant smoke, saccharin, or isoamyl acetate, better known as banana oil, are all accepted methods for qualitative fit testing, depending on the type of filter being used. Respirators should be regularly inspected and maintained to be certain that they're in good working condition. When you can smell or taste the contaminant, the respirator becomes hard to breathe through or physically damaged, or the manufacturer's recommended service life has expired, follow these guidelines. For maintenance-free respirators, the entire respirator must be discarded and replaced. For cartridge-type respirators, replace the appropriate filters or cartridges, or, when necessary, the facepiece. It's important to understand that every respirator has its limitations, and that eventually it will need to be replaced or serviced to remain effective. For all types of respirators, the manufacturer's use and limitation instructions must be read and understood before the respirator is used. If your job requires that you wear a respirator, you'll want to be sure you've been trained on the specific care and use procedures for the respirator you'll be using. Understanding how airborne contaminants present a danger to your health. Understanding respiratory hazards you encounter. Understanding how to select the proper respirator. And training in the care and use of the respirator. These are the four essential elements of respiratory protection. Remember, it's easy to take good breathing for granted until it's gone. Don't let it happen to you. Be smart. Wear a respirator. Wear it properly and take care of it. Your health and life depend on it.